That night, in a mansion overflowing with luxury and power, the atmosphere was one of pure ostentation. Everything in the environment reflected the arrogance of those who lived there. The millionaire, known for being cruel and ruthless, was hosting yet another of his extravagant parties. Surrounded by friends, businessmen, and influential figures, he was the center of attention, enjoying his wealth like a king in his own castle. Among the guests, however, was an unexpected presence, the waitress he had hired only to serve drinks. In his eyes, she was insignificant. As the party continued, amid laughter, conversations, and an endless flow of champagne, the millionaire, in a fit of arrogance and cruelty, decided that the night needed something more. Something not on the menu. With a malicious smile on his lips, he announced loudly, "Let's liven things up. You, come here." He pointed directly at the waitress. All eyes turned to her, surprised by the sudden summons. What no one knew was that the millionaire had a clear goal, to humiliate that woman. He knew her only for the modest job of serving, and in his mind, there was no better way to entertain his guests than to see her embarrassed. "Do you know how to play the piano?" he asked, gesturing toward the grand piano in the middle of his enormous living room. The imposing instrument was there just for decoration, a showpiece that few dared to use. The audience in the room chuckled softly, already anticipating disaster. The idea that a simple waitress could play anything beyond serving trays seemed ridiculous. The tension in the air intensified. The waitress hesitated. She understood what was happening, and her eyes showed a mix of fear and resistance. He, however, insisted, "Go ahead. Let's see what you're capable of." The smile on his face made it clear that he expected a fiasco, a source of cheap entertainment for his evening. And so, under the weight of all those gazes, she approached the piano. The room was filled with anticipation. She could barely hide her nervousness, but something inside her pushed her forward. Sitting on the bench, her trembling hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Everyone expected an imminent disaster, the kind of spectacle of humiliation the millionaire had envisioned. However, the second her fingers touched the first notes, the entire atmosphere changed. The sound that came from the piano wasn't clumsy, it wasn't flawed. On the contrary, it was a deep and touching melody, which made time seem to stop inside that mansion. The laughter that echoed through the corners fell silent. What was supposed to be an act of public humiliation instead began to touch the souls of those present. The notes flowed with unexpected precision and sensitivity, leaving everyone incredulous. This woman, whom no one there knew, was displaying a talent that no one could have imagined. The millionaire, who had been sneering before, was now serious. Each note seemed to strike something deep within him. The audience around stood still, trapped in a mix of shock and enchantment. That melody, so soft and yet so intense, began to do something even more unexpected. It awakened memories in the man who, minutes earlier, had been entertained by the prospect of humiliation. He couldn't understand how, but those notes took him back to a time he had tried to forget. A time when he, himself, dreamed of being someone very different. A time when the piano was his refuge, and music was his dream. Now, sitting in his own mansion, surrounded by luxury and power, he found himself facing a truth he had avoided for years. That woman, playing that piano, was reviving in him a forgotten part of who he was. The choices that had turned him into the cold and calculating man he was today began to weigh. But there was more. How did she know how to play like that? And why did that particular melody seem to speak so directly to his soul? The discomfort inside him grew with each note, with each chord. As the music flowed, a painful truth began to emerge. Something he had deeply buried in his mind, something that melody was bringing back with full force. The guests, still silent, were spellbound by the beauty of the performance, but the millionaire, he couldn't hide the internal turmoil that was taking over him. How could a simple waitress provoke such a strong reaction in him? Could it be that this woman knew more about his past than he imagined? As the last notes echoed through the room, a question hung in the air, silent but powerful. what was this woman trying to reveal? And more importantly, what would the millionaire discover about himself before the night was over? This will not just be a story of revenge or unexpected talent. What is to come goes far beyond what any of those present could have imagined. Now, what started as a power play is about to transform into a revelation that will change everything. Are you ready to discover what this millionaire is hiding? And more than that, are you ready to see how a melody can change the destiny of everyone? Subscribe to the channel now, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss this story. Prepare yourself for an emotional journey that will truly surprise you. What seemed like a simple act of humiliation will turn into something much greater and unforgettable. Stay until the end, because this story will move you. Jonathan Davenport's mansion was the perfect representation of its owner, grand, imposing, and cold. Every architectural detail, from the marble columns to the crystal chandeliers, exuded the power he had amassed over the years. Jonathan was a successful man, or at least, he was known as such in the business world. His fortune came from years of relentless investments, tough decisions, and often ethically questionable actions. It was not uncommon to hear stories about his cruelty, about how he rose by crushing anyone in his way. To him, everything was a power game, and he always knew he was one step ahead of everyone. Jonathan had no family. He distanced himself from any personal ties as soon as he realized that his ambition couldn't be fueled by distractions. From a young age, he had learned that to achieve the success he desired, he would need to give up a lot, even his own dreams. No one knew, but many years ago, Jonathan had a dream quite different from the world he lived in now. Before he was the arrogant magnate the public knew, he had been a young man passionate about music. The piano, especially, had been his passion, but he traded that dream for the promise of a life without limits. Now, living surrounded by people who sought his approval or his fortune, Jonathan had become an empty man, but he was incapable of realizing it. He was always in control. Everyone who entered his life, directly or indirectly, was part of his game, his strategies. The mansion where he lived was a silent witness to this. The parties he hosted, like the one that night, were always filled with influential, powerful people, but deep down, everyone was there for something he could offer. Among the guests that night was Grace Parker, a young waitress who had been hired to serve at the party. Jonathan barely noticed her, just as he barely noticed anyone outside his circle of influence. To him, Grace was just another piece on the board, someone who was part of the environment but had no significance. What he didn't know, and what the people around Grace were unaware of, was the burden she carried. Grace was not just a simple waitress. At 27, she had faced a series of hardships that led her to abandon her dreams. Like Jonathan, she had a story with music. But unlike him, she hadn't traded her talent for ambition. She lost it to the harsh circumstances of life. Grace grew up in a humble family, where every penny was accounted for. As a child, she showed an exceptional talent for the piano, a gift that her family, although poor, always encouraged. For years, Grace dedicated herself to the instrument, dreaming of one day living off music. However, reality hit hard when her mother fell ill, and Grace had to give up her dreams to support the household. She quit music school and started working simple jobs to help with expenses. The piano, which had once been her refuge, was now just a painful reminder of a life she could no longer live. Still, there was something in Grace that Jonathan's eyes couldn't see at first glance, a silent strength, a resilience she carried in her discreet way of moving through the hall. She was there, that night, doing her job without drawing attention, as she always did. But there was something different in the air, something that connected her to everything that was about to happen. As the night wore on, and guests drank and laughed around Jonathan, he felt especially confident. He had just closed another lucrative deal, something that left him in a great mood. That's when, for the first time that night, his eyes landed on Grace. She was serving drinks silently, without seeming to notice she was being observed. It was at that moment that, on a whim, Jonathan decided it would be interesting to use the young waitress as entertainment for his guests. To him, Grace was a stranger, a person who couldn't offer anything beyond her servile function. But what would be more fun than putting her in an embarrassing situation, just to see how she would react? Jonathan always liked to test people's limits, especially those he saw as inferior. He approached Grace with a smile that, to those who knew him, was a harbinger of something unpleasant. "Do you play the piano?" he asked, his voice tinged with disdain. Grace stopped, surprised by the question. She didn't expect anyone to talk to her that night, least of all the host of the party. She hesitated before answering. The piano was a part of her she had left behind, something she no longer spoke about openly. But there was Jonathan, a powerful and feared man, waiting for her answer. Without waiting for a direct reply, Jonathan looked at the grand piano that occupied the center of the living room and said, with a cold smile on his lips, "Why don't you show us what you can do? Go ahead, play something. Who knows, maybe you'll surprise us." The guests, curious and with a malicious gleam in their eyes, began to pay attention. Grace felt the weight of those gazes. She knew what was happening. Jonathan wanted to humiliate her, he wanted to turn her into the evening's entertainment. Everyone expected her to fail, to make a mistake or prove to be inadequate. The piano, a part of her life she cherished so dearly and painfully, was now a trap. She looked at the piano, feeling the whirlwind of emotions it stirred in her. But somehow, she knew she had no choice. Her life had always been made of tough choices. And now, even in the face of imminent humiliation, she decided to face the challenge. Without saying a word, Grace walked toward the piano, feeling Jonathan's eyes pinned on her. The audience around was eager, expecting the inevitable disaster. But what no one there knew, not even Jonathan, was that this would be the night when everything would change. Grace, with slightly trembling hands, took a deep breath before playing the first notes, and in that instant, the night took a turn no one could have predicted. The living room of the mansion was in absolute silence. The guests' eyes were all fixed on Grace, now seated at the grand piano. The first notes echoed through the room, soft and hesitant, as if she was testing the waters. Jonathan watched from his place, arms crossed, a slight sneer on his lips. To him, this was just another spectacle, a joke to pass the time and amuse his friends. He was confident that, within a few minutes, everyone would be laughing again, and Grace would be just another among the many he had humiliated over the years. But as the melody began to take shape, something different happened. The room, which had been filled with laughter and chatter, now immersed itself completely in the music. Each note seemed to tell a story, each chord carried an emotional weight that no one there could ignore. The air was heavy, dense with the intensity of Grace's performance. Her expression, focused and serene, belied the internal turmoil she felt. She knew that this moment wasn't just a display, it was a reunion with a part of herself she had locked away for years. It was the echo of dreams she hadn't allowed to blossom. Grace's fingers moved over the keys with a precision and delicacy that left the audience speechless. The music, a soft and melancholic melody, seemed to grow with each measure, revealing layers of emotions that many there might not fully understand, but couldn't ignore. Jonathan, who had initially looked away, as if bored, was now beginning to watch the scene with increasing attention. Something about that melody, about this young woman, was disturbing him in a way he couldn't identify. "She's good," someone whispered among the guests, breaking the silence with an observation that seemed obvious, but at that moment carried unexpected weight. Jonathan, hearing this, felt a pang of discomfort. He knew that Grace was going far beyond what he had anticipated. The show he thought would be a public humiliation was taking a different direction. His eyes narrowed as he watched Grace's fluid movements over the piano, and for the first time that night, he began to question his decision to put her there. When the music reached its emotional climax, Jonathan felt something he hadn't expected, a connection. The notes she played hit him in a disconcerting way, as if each one was pulling an invisible thread inside him, a thread he had buried for years. The music brought up vague memories, of a time when he himself would sit at a piano, with dreams and aspirations that now seemed to belong to another life. The melody seemed loaded with something familiar, a feeling he couldn't pinpoint but couldn't ignore. Grace continued playing, her body flowing with the music, and the guests were mesmerized. No one dared to speak. The silence was filled only by the notes echoing through the walls, reverberating in every corner of the mansion like a ghostly reminder of something lost. Jonathan, seated at the back of the room, began to shift uncomfortably. He crossed and uncrossed his legs, adjusted himself in the chair, as if trying to escape the growing sense of discomfort. At that moment, a voice beside him, soft but laden with curiosity, broke the silence. "Jonathan, did you know her before the party? It seems that, she plays as if she has a story to tell." Jonathan turned slowly to face his friend, a businessman like him, but with an artistic sensitivity that Jonathan had always despised. "No," he replied curtly. "She's just a waitress. Maybe she had a few lessons in the past. Nothing more." But the tension in his voice was clear, and the friend noticed. "Are you sure about that?" he insisted, with an intrigued look. "She doesn't seem like just a waitress. Not with that talent." Jonathan didn't respond, but the discomfort inside him only grew. There was something about that music, something about that woman, that he couldn't explain. He was used to controlling everything, to predicting every situation. But now, sitting there, listening to Grace play, he felt control slipping through his fingers. As the music began to calm down, softening its notes, Grace closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of total immersion in the melody. She knew that, at that moment, everyone was looking at her. But she didn't care. It wasn't for them, not for Jonathan, and much less for the guests. It was for herself. It was a release, a reconciliation with a part of her soul she believed was lost. But then, the music took an unexpected turn. Jonathan, who was trying to contain the growing anxiety within him, began to realize something. The melody changed, subtly at first, but with a clear purpose. The notes became more personal, more painful. He narrowed his eyes, listening to each chord with more attention. What was that? How was she able to make him feel all that? Grace, without saying a word, was revealing something. Not through words, but through music. Each measure seemed to carry a message that she was sending directly to him, as if the piano keys were her confessions. Jonathan felt this clearly, but he didn't know why. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more that sensation grew inside him. When the final note finally resonated, there was a moment of absolute silence. No one dared to applaud immediately. The impact of the performance was palpable. And, at the back of the room, Jonathan felt an uncomfortable truth emerge. Something he didn't want to admit. Something he was about to confront. Grace stood up slowly, without looking directly at the audience. Her eyes briefly met Jonathan's before averting them. She knew what she had done. And he knew it too. But what she had just revealed was only beginning to unravel. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some still stunned by Grace's talent. But Jonathan couldn't move. Something had changed that night, and he knew that, somehow, he was about to discover a truth that he had been burying for a long time. He tried to pull himself together, to smile confidently at his friends, but the discomfort was still there, throbbing in his mind. What had she just done? What was that music trying to say? And, more importantly, why was it affecting him so much? Grace had left something in the air, something he couldn't ignore. But what exactly? It was all connected to an old memory, something he had buried deeply. Now, what seemed to be just a cruel game was turning into something much greater. And the truth was about to emerge. The silence in Jonathan Davenport's mansion was oppressive. The guests, until then enraptured by Grace's performance, began to disperse into low conversations, trying to process what had just happened. Some were impressed, others intrigued, but no one seemed to know exactly how to react. Jonathan, on the other hand, remained motionless in his place. Thoughts swirled in his mind like a growing storm. He was stunned. The impact of the melody still reverberated in his chest, hitting him deeper than he would like to admit. Grace remained near the piano, not looking directly at him. Her fingers still trembled slightly, not from the previous fear, but from the intensity of what she had just done. She had poured her soul into that music, not for the guests, but for Jonathan. Every note was played with purpose, every chord carried a memory, a veiled message. She knew he had felt it, knew that this man so accustomed to controlling everything was now disoriented, questioning something he had tried to forget for years. Finally, Jonathan stood up. The sound of his chair echoed in the room, drawing the attention of a few closer guests. He walked up to Grace, his steps slow, as if the ground beneath his feet had become uncertain. When he stopped before her, the two were silent for a moment. The weight of that moment seemed overwhelming. He tried to pull himself together, his face hardening in an attempt to hide what he was feeling. "I have to admit," he began, his voice firm, but with a subtle tremor. "You surprised me." Grace raised her eyes slowly, facing him for the first time that night with firmness. There was an unexpected strength in her gaze, a firmness that Jonathan hadn't anticipated. She was no longer the timid waitress from before. There was something deeper there, something he couldn't fully decipher, but it unsettled him. "It wasn't my intention to surprise you, Jonathan," she said, her voice calm but laden with restrained emotion. "The music was for me." He frowned, trying to understand the meaning of her words. The confusion inside him was growing, but before he could respond, Grace continued. "You don't remember, do you?" Her question was simple, but its weight fell on him like a stone. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. How could she imply that he knew her? He was a busy man, surrounded by faces that came and went from his life without leaving a trace. She, a simple waitress, couldn't be more than that. "I don't understand what you're talking about," he replied, trying to regain his tone of superiority. But something in the way Grace looked at him left him unnerved. She didn't flinch, didn't avert her gaze. Jonathan, used to being in control, now found himself in front of a woman who seemed to hold something over him, something he didn't yet understand. "You used to play, you know." Grace dropped the phrase with a softness that was almost cruel, as if revealing a truth that Jonathan would rather keep buried. "A long time ago. Before you became who you are now. And that music was yours." Jonathan stepped back a pace. His heart raced, his chest tightened. How did she know that? How could this woman, whom he barely knew, know something he never shared with anyone? The piano, the dream, that belonged to a part of his past he had left behind, a past he had buried under years of ruthless decisions and cold business deals. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, his gaze was not one of disdain but of pure shock. "How, do you know that?" His voice was lower than he expected, almost a whisper. It felt as if each word was being pulled from within him against his will. Grace gave a small smile, but it was a sad smile, laden with memories. "You taught me to play, Jonathan." That phrase hit Jonathan like a punch. He looked at her as if he was seeing a ghost, someone he had erased from his memory a long time ago. He began to remember. Slowly, in fragmented ways, but the memory was coming. A young Jonathan, long before he became the ruthless magnate he was today, sitting at the piano. Beside him, a little girl with curious eyes and small hands trying to mimic his movements. He had completely forgotten. "Grace. You were the caretaker's daughter," he said, his voice almost choking. The pieces began to fit together, but the sense of collapse was greater than he could handle. He had forgotten. That girl, whom he had taught the first notes on the piano, who used to watch him play with silent admiration, was now standing before him, revealing a truth he did not want to face. Grace nodded, her eyes now filled with more than just sadness. "Yes. My parents worked for your family. I used to watch you play." You were my hero, Jonathan. I dreamed of being like you. Jonathan was speechless. He didn't know what to say, how to respond to this. Everything he had become, everything he had built, seemed insignificant in the face of the revelation happening there. He remembered Grace as a child, but he never imagined she would follow him for so long. And now, she was there, bringing back a part of his life he had made a point of forgetting. You changed, she said, the sadness in her voice growing. After your family fell apart, you changed. You became cold, ruthless. And I moved on. Jonathan shook his head, as if trying to ward off the guilt that was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to be confronted with who he had become. Grace, I didn't know. I didn't remember. No, she responded calmly. You chose not to remember. Those words fell on Jonathan like a sentence. Grace was not just reminding him of his past but also pointing out the choices that had turned him into the man he was today. He didn't want to confront this. He preferred to believe that his decisions were necessary, that everything he had sacrificed was for a greater good, for his success. But now, facing Grace, he began to question everything. The hall, which once seemed like a refuge of power, was now a suffocating prison. Jonathan felt the walls closing in around him. His guests were still there, but he could barely hear their voices. His attention was completely focused on the woman in front of him, on the painful reminder of who he had been and who he had lost. Grace stepped closer to him, her eyes fixed on his, and said softly but firmly, "The music was yours, Jonathan. You gave it up. You gave up who you were. And now, all that's left is the man you chose to become." Jonathan felt a knot forming in his throat. He wanted to respond, wanted to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Grace was right. He knew it. Every choice he had made, every step toward success, had taken him further and further away from the young man who once dreamed of music, of something beyond power and money. Now, the music that echoed in his mind was a bitter reminder of what he had lost. Grace gave him one last look, filled with a mix of compassion and disappointment, before walking away. Jonathan watched her walk to the door, feeling emptier than ever. What could he say? What could he do? The truth was clear, and its weight was unbearable. When the door closed behind Grace, Jonathan remained there, standing in the center of his mansion, surrounded by luxury but completely alone. The echo of the music was still in his ears, a melody he could no longer ignore. And then, in that moment of absolute silence, Jonathan realized that the true cost of his success had been much higher than he ever imagined. Jonathan stood still in the center of his imposing room, but the environment around him seemed to shrink. His eyes were fixed on the door through which Grace had left, but his mind was trapped somewhere else, in another time. The revelation that had just occurred left him shaken in a way he couldn't immediately process. The piano, which had once been just an expensive ornament, now seemed like a symbol of what he had lost. Grace's music had ripped him out of his meticulously controlled life and thrown him back in time, to a period he had buried. The guests began to disperse, realizing that the mood had changed. The murmur of conversations and laughter dissipated as people left the mansion, one by one. The brightness and ostentation of the party were swallowed by an atmosphere of tension and silence. No one dared approach Jonathan. He still maintained his hard expression, that look of superiority that had always accompanied him, but inside he felt he was crumbling. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. An old friend, Charles, who had been watching the scene from afar, approached slowly. He was not just a business partner, he had known Jonathan for decades, before his meteoric rise to the top of the corporate world. He noticed something different in Jonathan's eyes that night, something he hadn't seen in a long time: doubt. "Jonathan," began Charles, cautiously, "are you okay?" Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He remained standing, as if frozen in his thoughts. When he finally looked at Charles, there was a glimmer of confusion and despair in his eyes, something Jonathan always avoided showing. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. It was a confession he would never make, not to anyone, but there, in that moment, Jonathan was confronting something greater than he ever imagined. Charles frowned, stepping a little closer. "What happened to you? I don't remember the last time I saw you like this." Jonathan took a few steps back, running a hand through his hair, his mind still racing with the memories Grace had revived. He wanted to understand, wanted to figure out how this had slipped from his memory for so long. The young girl he had once taught to play the piano, the caretaker's daughter, how could he forget? Worse still, how could he become the man standing there now, so different from the one who once dreamed of music? "I knew her, Charles," he said, the words coming out with difficulty. "Grace. She was someone from my past, from a time I thought would never come back." Charles didn't know what to say. He had never seen Jonathan like this, so lost. The Jonathan he knew was always so controlled, always in command. But now, he seemed like a man dealing with an avalanche of emotions he didn't know how to process. "Jonathan," began Charles carefully, "if she's part of your past, then why is this affecting you so much now? What she said, what she played, why is this making you question everything?" Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew he had no choice. "Because that music was mine. It was my music. A melody I used to play, years ago, before all this." He looked around the mansion, his eyes scanning the walls covered in art and luxury furniture, but none of it seemed to matter now. Jonathan felt the emptiness of every inch of that place. "I had dreams, Charles. Dreams that didn't involve business, money, or power. I wanted to be something more." Charles looked at him, surprised. "I never knew that." "You didn't know," Jonathan replied, a bitter smile appearing on his lips. "No one knew. Because I erased that part of me. I buried it to get where I am today." Silence settled between the two, a silence heavy and full of meaning. Charles understood more than anyone what Jonathan was confessing. He himself had made sacrifices in the name of success, but what Jonathan was revealing was something deeper. Something that touched the core of who he was. Jonathan, still with a confused mind, moved away from Charles and walked to the piano. His hands touched the keys softly, almost as if he feared the instrument would reject him. He hadn't played in years, hadn't even thought about it. The piano was just a decoration now, an empty symbol. But there, standing in front of it, with Grace's words still echoing in his mind, he felt a desperate need to reconnect with who he used to be. When his fingers pressed the first note, the sound echoed through the room like a ghost from the past. He closed his eyes, trying to remember, trying to connect with the music that once flowed through his veins like blood. But now, it seemed distant, as if he had lost the ability to play with his soul. Charles, watching from afar, noticed the internal struggle Jonathan was facing. "Jonathan, maybe it's too late to go back," he said, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to say those words. "You've built a completely different life now. Maybe the music is in the past." Jonathan stopped, his hands still on the keys. Charles's words made sense, but there was something in his chest he couldn't ignore. "I don't know," he replied, without turning around. "But Grace, she showed me something today that I can no longer pretend I didn't see. I gave up on who I was. And no matter how much I have all this," he looked around the mansion again, "I have nothing." Charles stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Maybe you need to talk to her," he suggested. "Understand what she was trying to tell you with that music." Jonathan nodded slowly, knowing that Charles was right. He needed answers, needed to understand what Grace was trying to show him beyond the music. What else was there? What did she know that he didn't? Hours later, when the mansion was already empty and silence hung like a heavy mist, Jonathan picked up his phone. He didn't know exactly what to say, but he knew he needed to talk to her. Needed to understand what was happening inside him. His life had always been marked by choices and sacrifices, but now he found himself at a crossroads he never imagined. It wasn't just about Grace or the music, but about a part of himself he had abandoned. He dialed the number Grace had left on the temporary work contract and waited. The phone rang, and for a moment, he felt the fear that she wouldn't answer. But then, her voice came from the other end of the line, soft but filled with emotion. "Jonathan?" He took a deep breath, his voice almost faltering as he answered. "Grace, we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and Jonathan could almost hear the weight of what was to come. "I was waiting for you to call," she replied, with no surprise in her voice. "There's a lot you need to understand." "I know," he said, feeling vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. "I know." The silence that followed was not of discomfort but of mutual understanding. Something had been revealed that night, and both knew that nothing would be the same from that moment on. Jonathan, for the first time in years, was willing to face who he had become and what he had left behind. And Grace, with her music and her memories, was the key to opening that door. When he hung up the phone, Jonathan knew he was about to embark on a journey that could redefine his life. It wouldn't be easy, and he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain, he could no longer ignore the man who once dreamed of something greater than power and money. And now, alongside Grace, he was determined to discover what that meant. Jonathan hung up the phone, the echo of the last conversation with Grace still pulsing in his mind. Something inside him had changed profoundly, as if, after so many years of control and power, the facade he had built was finally beginning to crumble. The air in the mansion, once heavy with the silence of the emptying party, now felt suffocating. He knew that the call was just the first step. Grace didn't just want him to remember who he was, but to confront what he had done to himself over the years. As he walked to the window, looking out over the vastness of the land surrounding his house, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the life he had created. He had built an empire, shaped by the strength of his ambition and the willingness to sacrifice anything to reach the top. But now, in the light of Grace's revelation, it all seemed like a distant echo of who he truly was. The mansion, the business, the power, were just illusions that kept him away from himself. The question that tormented him now was, what to do from here? The next morning, Jonathan couldn't concentrate on his usual business meetings. His mind was full of confused memories, fragments of a past he had buried, but which now emerged with full force. He had learned the art of shutting off emotions and staying focused, but now, something inside him was broken. He needed to see Grace again, not just to better understand what she knew, but to find a way to deal with what he had become. When he arrived at the place where Grace lived, a simple neighborhood far from the luxury he was accustomed to, Jonathan felt a deep discomfort. He, who always walked with confidence, was now there, unsure, trying to figure out exactly what he was looking for. There was a moral dilemma taking shape in his mind. How could he reconcile the man he was now with the young man who once loved music and had innocent dreams? Grace welcomed him calmly, but not without a certain distance. She had noticed that Jonathan was still conflicted, struggling against the very truths she had forced him to confront. They sat in silence for a few moments, the room charged with the tension of what needed to be said but had not yet been spoken. "I knew you would come," Grace finally said, breaking the silence. "When I played that music, I knew that something in you was still there, trapped beneath everything you had built." Jonathan looked at her, feeling the sincerity in those words. He knew she was right, but he didn't know how to put into words the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling. "You showed me something I didn't want to see, Grace," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "I buried a part of me for so long that I don't even know if it's possible to go back. Everything I did, the choices, the sacrifices, how can I fix that now?" Grace watched him, seeing the internal struggle etched on his face. She knew that Jonathan, despite all the power he had accumulated, was vulnerable. This was a man who never allowed himself to feel, who built walls around himself to avoid pain, but now he was exposed. And the question hanging in the air was simple but devastating: was there a way to redeem himself after so much time? "You can't fix the past, Jonathan," said Grace, with a frankness that cut through the air. "No one can. But you can choose what to do from here. The music, what it represented for you, wasn't just about what you wanted. It was about who you were, and who you could have been. And the question now is, who do you want to be from now on?" Jonathan lowered his head, reflecting on her words. He had spent so many years chasing the idea of success that he lost sight of what really mattered. Everything he built was to fill a void he never wanted to acknowledge. But now, in front of Grace, he realized that continuing to ignore this was no longer an option. The real question he needed to answer was whether he had the courage to face what he had become and, perhaps, try to be a better person. "I don't know if I can change," he said, more to himself than to Grace. "I became this person, a man who makes tough decisions, who does what is necessary. I don't know if there's room for anything else now." Grace looked at him, her gaze full of an understanding he didn't expect. "You're wrong," she said calmly. "Change is always possible. But only you can decide if you want it. If you want something different for your life." Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was at stake. He was standing before a choice that could redefine the rest of his life, and for the first time, there was no clear or easy answer. The moral dilemma was simple but deeply complex. Continue living the life he had created, based on power and control, or try to reconnect with the man he once was, the man who loved music, who had dreams that did not only involve material success. "I don't know if I can go back," Jonathan admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I built all this, my life, my career. If I change now, everything I've done up to this point will have been in vain." "No," Grace replied, without hesitation. "Nothing you've done was in vain, Jonathan. Your choices brought you here, taught you something. But they don't have to define who you'll be forever. You can be more than the man who built this empire. If the music is still inside you, if there is still something that touches your heart, then maybe it's time to listen to it again." Those words penetrated deep into Jonathan. He didn't know how to respond, because she had touched on something he had avoided for so long, the idea that his life could have been different. And not just different, but better, more meaningful. He stood up, pacing back and forth in Grace's small room, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. "But what do you want from me, Grace?" he finally asked, turning to her. "You made me see all this, made me remember who I was. But now what? What do you expect me to do?" Grace watched him in silence for a moment before answering simply, "I don't expect anything from you, Jonathan. I'm not here to demand anything. I showed you this because I thought you needed to remember. From here on, the path is yours. You decide what you will do with everything you've discovered." Jonathan was quiet, processing her words. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely out of control, without a clear plan, not knowing what the future held. He was used to controlling every aspect of his life, but now, facing this crossroads, everything seemed uncertain. "I was never good at dealing with uncertainties," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Grace smiled slightly, as if she understood what he was saying. "Uncertainty is part of life, Jonathan. What matters is what you do with it." Jonathan knew she was right. There was a part of him that longed to reconnect with who he was before all this. But the dilemma was deep. If he chose to follow this path, he would be giving up everything he had built, everything that had defined his life up to that point. And that was frightening. "Maybe I need time," he said, more to himself than to Grace. "Maybe," Grace agreed, with a lightness in her voice that contrasted with the depth of the moment. "But, Jonathan, time doesn't wait for anyone. If you really want to change, the first step needs to be now." Her words hung in the air like a silent but powerful challenge. Jonathan knew that, despite his doubts, she was right. He could no longer ignore who he was, or what he had lost along the way. The real question now was whether he had the courage to act on it. He looked at Grace one last time, with an expression of silent gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity he rarely showed. "For reminding me of who I was." Grace smiled, a soft and understanding smile. "I only showed you the way, Jonathan. The rest is up to you." With that, Jonathan left Grace's house, feeling the weight of the decisions he would need to make in the coming days. The path ahead was not clear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to confront what he had left behind, and maybe, who knows, begin to change. Days had passed since the last conversation between Jonathan and Grace, but the impact of that encounter still reverberated in his mind. Jonathan, a man who had always had control of everything, found himself facing a difficult choice: continue with the life he had built, or accept that something much greater awaited him if he had the courage to embrace change. He began to reflect on his life, his business, and especially the man he had become. Grace's music had brought back not just memories but also the desire to be more than just a magnate. Jonathan knew he couldn't continue as he was. His life of financial success was no longer enough. It was as if the music, which had been silent within him for so long, was calling him again with a force he could no longer ignore. He locked himself in his office, staring at the figures that had defined his life for decades. For the first time, those figures seemed empty. He made a decision. Jonathan began to sell part of his empire, not to completely abandon his business life but to make room for something more. He wanted to go back to his roots. There was an old music school, closed for years, in a neighborhood where he had grown up. Jonathan decided to buy it and restore it, turning the place into a free music education center for low-income children, young people who, like Grace and himself, had the dream of living off music but didn't have the resources to pursue it. It was his way of reconnecting with what he had lost, but also a way to do something meaningful. He no longer wanted to be known as the ruthless millionaire, he wanted to leave a legacy that went beyond wealth. Jonathan decided to reopen the school's doors with a special event, where Grace would be the guest of honor to play the same melody that had changed his life. On the big day, the music school was full. Children and young people who dreamed of music filled the rooms with enthusiasm. Jonathan watched from a distance, a discreet smile on his face, as Grace took the stage, the piano waiting for her. She looked at him from afar, and their eyes met briefly, a look that said it all. Grace knew what that school meant to him, and to everyone there. She sat at the piano and, once again, played the melody that had connected them so many years ago. But this time, the music did not carry the weight of old memories or regrets. It was a melody of redemption, of new beginnings. Jonathan, sitting in the front row, listened to every note with an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. The notes not only touched his soul but also seemed to free him. The man he once was there, back, but in a more complete, wiser form. He had found his way again, and the music he had once abandoned was now part of his life again. After the performance, Grace approached Jonathan, the two in silence for a moment. There was no need for many words. Both knew what it meant. "You made the right choice," Grace said, smiling. Jonathan nodded, with a silent gratitude in his eyes. "I did. And you were the reason for it." They briefly hugged, a hug of mutual recognition, of a friendship born from a shared past and a deep transformation. With the music school reopened and running, Jonathan found a new purpose. He never completely abandoned his business, but now, his life was balanced between what he did to maintain his fortune and what he did to feed his soul. He began giving piano lessons to children on weekends, rediscovering the passion he had set aside for so long. He not only regained his connection with music but also with humanity, with the people around him. Grace, for her part, continued her musical career, inspired by the reconciliation with her own past. She performed on several occasions, always carrying with her the story of how music connected her to someone she never expected. Her success also brought her inner peace, knowing that, in a way, she helped Jonathan find his way back to himself. Jonathan knew that the journey to that point had not been easy. He had to confront the choices he had made, the sacrifices that had cost him an essential part of his life. But in the end, he found something much greater than the power and success he always sought. He found himself. And so, what would you do if, suddenly, you were confronted with the choices that took you away from who you really were? Jonathan's story shows us that, no matter how far we have gone down a path, there is always the possibility of return. There is always a choice. Sometimes, we are forced to face painful truths about ourselves, but it is in this confrontation that we find the true meaning of our lives. Jonathan had to lose and rediscover music to understand who he truly was. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about what you might be leaving behind? Now, we want to hear from you. What impacted you most about this story? Have you ever felt like Jonathan at some point in your life? Leave your comment below, share your opinion and reflections on this journey of transformation and self-discovery. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the Inspiring Twists channel for more stories like this, full of twists and life lessons. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming videos, and if you liked this story, leave your like. Together, we can continue to bring stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on who we are and what we can be. With that, we conclude the story of Jonathan and Grace, a journey that reminds us of the importance of never losing sight of what moves us inside. After all, sometimes, the greatest success is not in accumulating wealth but in reclaiming our essence.